It's really good to start our gathering with that mantra and to identify together as one group in consciousness, aligned with the new group of world servers, the group of all who love and serve. Such a muscular, intelligent, deeply thinking group at this time in our history. So the main theme for our event today contains two essential thoughts: the role that crisis plays in the spiritual life of an individual, a group, a nation, and the world of nations, and the thought that humanity as a whole is on a path to global cooperation. And in this first session, we're going to explore these thoughts from an Ageless Wisdom perspective. It's a core part of World Goodwill's work to shine a light on the idea that the path towards cooperation is something that's written into the DNA of humanity. Whether we like it or not, it's our spiritual destiny to transit from a competitive age to a cooperative age. This is a process that's underway, and it's what our history is all about. The only question is a question of time. How many generations does it take for cooperation to become the dominant pattern in international relations? The suggestion is that as a species, we're on an initiatory path, that all of us together, the human species as a unit, are undergoing what has been referred to by some writers as a great turning on the wheel in the orientation of human identity, human thought, human spirituality, and human action. What begins with a reorientation of energies and thoughts expresses itself in relationships. All dimensions of relationship, from the subjective to the objective, the vertical to the horizontal, the inner to the outer. And to look at the passage from competition to cooperation in international affairs is a way of looking at history. It's a way of shining the lenses in our glasses to identify where we see this happening. And it gives us an objective way of assessing progress in our entrance into a new age. Cooperation on a national scale, even cooperation within a nation and on the world stage, tends to grow in cycles. So what appear to be sudden transformational periods, like the founding of the UN, the signing of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or the end of the Cold War in recent times, tend to be followed by periods of realignment, when not much may appear to be happening as forces of materialism challenge the newly established norms. The norms are tested to see if they can hold and to see how deeply they are embedded in the structures and patterns of international relations. Constant and repeated presentations of conflicts challenge the new higher norms. This can sound like a depressing picture, yet from a spiritual perspective, it's out of this dialectic between higher principles and habitual, instinctual patterns of competition and power that the way we think about global cooperation becomes wiser and more intelligent. So instead of outright rejecting the forces opposing cooperation, we're driven to understand these forces as an aspect of ourselves and certainly of our own nations. As a result of repeated conflict, the incentive and the intent to cooperate becomes clearer, less ideological, in a sense, less aspirational, and more practical and rational in terms of what works and what doesn't seem to work. The cycle of conflict and crisis intensifies experiments with fresh, creative ways to enhance cooperation. And we've certainly seen this in studies of international affairs from diplomatic circles, academic institutes, and think tanks around the world. And I'm hoping that we will see this in the panel discussion in this next session of this gathering today. This process of conflict and crisis is a sign that life is really testing us. It's testing us as individuals and testing us as nations and as humankind, throwing down challenges, throwing down the gauntlet in a way, and inviting us to see where we stand in the relation between our ideals and principles and the way we show up and are present in the world. This is happening in our lives just as it's happening in our nations and in the world. Different mythologies speak of this time as a transition from an age of separation and competition to an age of cooperation that's being driven and empowered from higher forces of soul and spirit. Potencies of spiritual power, the Christ, the Buddha, and all the prophets, rishis, and saints of all traditions, revealing previously undreamt of realities of wholeness and interdependence, and ecologies of interpenetrating levels of being. Prophecies also speak of forces of love and pure good-heartedness pouring into the human psyche, expanding and deepening the spirit of relationship and the intelligent awareness of being part of something so much greater than one's own individual incarnation. These forces of love pouring into the human also allow us to see our own small individual incarnation as an expression of something universal. All the chaotic energies of transition in humanity as a whole are reflected within our own lives and our own spiritual path. Esoteric sources also speak of a third quality of energy pouring into humanity at this time, and that's a stimulation of the will. Of course, will energy is strong and it carries danger. Is it the higher or the lower will that's being fed from above? But while sensational news highlights the intensification of the will of separatists and groups concerned solely with their own interests, higher expressions of the will are also being stimulated. And not surprisingly, these receive very little attention in the media because they are, after all, behind the scenes. But the incoming energies are causing a deepening of the will to love, the will to cooperate with all who are motivated by higher principles, and a new living will to build justice and respect into our relationships, our communities, our nations, and our world, into our economics, politics, and education, drawing on the conversation that Lawrence and Thomas had earlier in London. There is a sense, as I would see it, that empathy, which Thomas spoke so well about, truly is growing in every profession, at the leading edge of thought in every single profession, every academic discipline. There is a growing awareness of not just the need for empathy, but of an emerging interest in and concern with empathy and empathic consciousness. These incoming energies not only inspire and open us up to new vistas of wholeness, but they also do their job by disturbing, provoking, and awakening the Pandora's box of unredeemed, unresolved forces in ourselves, in the psyche, in our nations and communities. These incoming spiritual energies provoke crises. Just as an individual's passage from childhood through the teenage years to adulthood is not some clear linear trajectory towards maturity and wisdom, so too is humanity's path towards global cooperation not a linear path. How could it possibly be when the path to cooperation can only emerge out of freedom and freely chosen decisions? The intersecting crises of this time are symbolized by the global pandemic, challenging the world to new levels of cooperation within nations and between nations. This crisis also challenges us to develop a new relationship with the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. For the goals and targets measure human development in quantifiable material terms, acquiring data to measure progress and ending poverty wherever it exists, measuring the quality and access to water and sanitation, access to quality education, the empowerment of women, and so on. Never before has there been this interest in measuring these sorts of changes. But achievement of the goals depends more than anything else on a mobilization of intelligent goodwill amongst the peoples of the world. For the transformation that's implied in the goals depends upon a deeper transformation of thought, attitudes, and values. It requires a reorientation towards the goal of building international relationships that reflect the oneness of all life, the essential sacredness of each and every human being, and the presence of the divine in all beings in the manifest world. Nothing less than a reawakening of faith in the universality of life and the sacredness of life in all its diversity is required in our time. For only then will the part and the whole be seen in right relation, be seen as a synthesis of life in expression and life in transition and movement towards new norms, towards a new stability, reflecting the entrance into what astrologers and esotericists and many traditions refer to as the Aquarian Age. Thank you, friends. I'm now going to pass over to Kathy, and we'll hear what she has to say. So Kathy, if you turn on your video.
I was trying to, but I don't seem to. Okay. All right. Now I can. All right.
Hi.
Thank you, Steve. And thank all of you for being here together with us at this time of opportunity, this interlude of the Scorpio new moon, which occurs very early tomorrow morning here in New York. And I guess I'd like to just take up where Steve left off, because the ability to bridge into a new age, into this incoming Aquarian age, is one of the key functions of this new group of world servers. And so I just wanted to share a few thoughts with you today about the underlying conditioning energies of this group and its primary function in this role as bridging between the past, the present, and the future. And in order to do that, I'd like to start off by sharing an ancient rule, one of the rules for group initiation, which was given out in the last book written by Alice Bailey with the Tibetan, called the Rays and the Initiations. And so this rule, I think, gives us an energetic picture of where this group is coming from, what it is, and where it's going, just in a few short words. It's one of the easier rules, but perhaps I'm not really fully understanding it, because the Tibetan says, if you think you understand the rules, you're fooling yourself. But this one is a little bit simpler than some of the others. So it goes as follows. Let the group serve as Aquarius indicates. Let Mercury speed the group upon the upward way. And let Taurus bring illumination and the attainment of the vision. Let the mark of the Savior, as the group toils in Pisces, be seen above the aura of the group. So Daniel, if you could show the slide now. Okay, thank you. This rule was accompanied by this diagram, which I think is very helpful when trying to understand abstract things. And here we see the group itself symbolized in the planet Mercury. We're told that the group is very like the energies of this planet, which is one of the faster moving planets in our solar system. So Mercury itself stands as a mediator. It's often referred to as the star of relationships. It's also referred to, has many names, Mercury, in true mercurial fashion. It's the sign of relationships, the sign of crisis, the star of Sirius. So in that regard, we can understand that Sirius being a major constellational life, reflective of Manas, pouring that stimulating energy of the mind into our planet, so too this new group of world servers acts in similar fashion to not only convey a mental polarization into the masses of humanity, but also to act as Sirius, which is the star of sensitivity. So the group itself becomes an energy center, a great synthesizing agent, just as Mercury takes in 7 times the light of the sun of any of the other planets and utilizes that great light to distribute to other planets, particularly our planet Earth. So too does the new group of world servers take in the energies from these 3 overshadowing constellations and blend them and fuse them and distribute them to the lower kingdoms in nature. So in terms of our relationship with Aquarius, as Steve said, it's the incoming energy. It's that which qualifies those initiates and members of the spiritual hierarchy who work with it and who are able to penetrate into this highest center, the center of the spiritual will, because that's where the true influx of Aquarian energy stems from. But the group is charged with mediating between this new incoming energy of the Aquarian age and the energies of the outgoing Piscean age, which brought to birth this group. The group is said in this rule to toil in the sign of Pisces, but it was also the sign that brought it forth. Pisces is the sign of the mediator, the sign of the world savior. And that's really the key function of this group as it mediates the plan into existence. So Aquarius symbolizes the future, that which is to come. Pisces symbolizes that which we're just passing out of. And the group, as it works with the as it role as a mediator, works within the energies of the sign of Taurus. And so it's helpful for us to ponder the nature of Taurus. It's known as the bull of God, with its one eye beaming light towards the goal. It's a very directed energy. It brings in, as Steve was mentioning, the first ray of will or power. There's tremendous strength when the Taurus individual or the Taurus group finds its purpose. And so the new group of world servers, if nothing else, has definitely found its purpose, which is to serve and uplift. And through the medium of Taurus, it's able to brook no obstacles in the fulfillment of that purpose. And so one of the other key functions that we're told characterizes the new group of world servers is its ability to work in the interludes. So these interludes in the spiritual teachings are known as the pauses between 2 activities, the moments of quiet when the past is receding and the future has yet to really make itself fully apparent. So it's sort of an in-between phase, and that's where the new group of world servers does its bridging work. by helping us to draw upon the past while at the same time projecting into the future. And so the new group serves a vital function in this world of divisions and disharmony, providing and bringing in the energy of the soul, bringing in the energy of the spiritual hierarchy, and through that means conveying vision to the world of men and women. Because we're told, might be a cliche, but it's true that without the vision, the people perish. And so that's one of the key functions that the new group provides, is a vision of the future possibilities of the new world, which coming into manifestation. And so the group takes opportunity of the interlude periods. And we know, those of us who are involved in this work know that this past year, 10 months ago, we passed through a major interlude cycle, the 7-year cycle of the new group of world servers, which brings in a flood tide of energy from the constellation Capricorn. And we're told an extra zodiacal constellation of intense magnitude and potency, which is aligned with the energy of Capricorn. So this poured in during the festival week in December, and we're still reeling from the effects of it. Again, it's a potent energy along the 1st and 7th ray lines. So it gives the group the potential and the power to bring spirit into matter and to fight fire with fire. Because as Steve mentioned again, the will can be appropriated by those with malicious intention, but it can also be appropriated by those of spiritual intention. And so there is a need to appropriate the fire, and the group was certainly gifted with that fire in December. And the energies have been working out throughout this entire year and will continue to work out as we move towards 2025, a very important cycle, another interlude period of great momentum in our planetary life, which will qualify the future. And I just wanted to finally speak of another interlude, again on the solstice period coming up. It's a beautiful symbol in the sky that's forming, and that will come to exactitude on December 21st. And I know many of you have heard of this great alignment between Jupiter and Saturn. Jupiter being a key planet in the Aquarian age, so it's particularly significant that we're celebrating this alignment, this beautiful alignment, which Blavatsky said, the alignment of Jupiter and Saturn 2,000 years ago in the sign of Pisces was really the signal of the coming of the Savior for that Piscean age. Now, coincidentally, 2,000 years later, on this day, sacred day of interlude in the annual cycle, there's another powerful alignment between these two great planets of Jupiter and Saturn in the sign of Aquarius, 0 degrees. So I can't help but think that this is a powerful symbol of hope and optimism and expectancy that our planet is taking a major step forward towards the great events that are due to unfold. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Kathy. Oh, you're muted, Kathy.
I wanted to introduce Michael. Thank you for being with us and for being the Mercury of our office and all of the great work you do in facilitating so many things.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Kathy. I love when you speak about astrology. I don't really understand it fully myself, but I sort of get a sense of these spiritual energies sort of permeating my consciousness, just listening to your talk. So thank you very much. I'd like to speak now just briefly, hopefully briefly, on 2 ideas related to our theme. First, I'd like to speak about the spiritual significance of crisis, what it means for something to be spiritual, and why crises is itself spiritual in nature. And I'd also like to speak even more briefly on the role that crises is playing in the life of humanity, and how this crisis is hastening humanity's evolution and pushing humanity towards its ideal. So there are many definitions of the word spiritual. The term is often used very broadly, and by some measures it even encompasses everything in the manifested and unmanifested universes. And while it is true that everything from the highest to the lowest, darkness and light, spirit and form and everything in between are all part of this one immutable principle, it is not true to say that everything is spiritual. And it's not true to say that everything is spiritual because doing so ignores the fact really of the manifested world itself, but also more importantly that the manifested world is imperfect and is in process of evolution. Alice Bailey wrote that that which is spiritual relates man to man and man to God. And what this tells us is that the spiritual is concerned fundamentally with relationships at all levels, and especially that great principle of relationship, which we call the soul. Now, the soul exists as God immanent in all things, in all forms. It is the source of unification. It's what makes unification possible, unity possible. And it makes unity possible because it affirms that despite all outer differences of race, of culture, of ideology, we all share the same essential nature. And so it is through this essential nature that the soul is able to relate each human being one to the other. So the principle, on a larger scale, we can also say that the principle of the soul unites all the kingdoms in nature together via what is called the great chain of hierarchy. And this great chain of hierarchy extends from the highest being upon our planet down all the way into the lowest levels of manifestation, what we call the mineral kingdom. And it is through this great chain of hierarchy that humanity as a whole is related to divinity, or to God transcendent. And so we have the soul existing in the form of an atom, the soul existing in an individual human being, the soul existing in humanity as a whole, and the soul existing in the entire planetary life. And all souls are one. So that's why we call it the principle of the soul. And this soul is what propels us forward upon the path of evolution. And it does so because it is concerned fundamentally with the perfecting of relationships and the achieving of the ideal towards which all evolution is proceeding. And this is perhaps the best definition of what is spiritual, is any forward motion upon the path of evolution. For true spiritual achievement always moves one closer to the ideal, towards the highest ideal which that form embodies. And it's important to remember that this sort of spiritual moving forward upon the path of evolution is universal, and that it occurs at many, many levels. Humanity, individuals within humanity, are all at different stages upon this path of evolution. And so we can see this great spiritual process occurring in all fields of human endeavor, whether it's the growth of a child into adulthood, or whether it's the training of the mind through academic study, or whether it's the raising of a family. All of these things can be just as spiritual as the religious or the mystical life, if they move one forward upon that path. And so where does crisis come in this sort of, in what is spiritual? The nature of crisis is deeply tied to the relationship, to spirituality, therefore, and also to the process of evolution. And I think it's important to remember that when we consider the nature of crises, we have to recognize that crises are essentially and always psychological in nature, even though they often have some sort of physical effect. The point of friction, which kind of constitutes a crisis, can always be traced back to the psyche, to the thinker, and to the process of thought. And therefore, it's true, in my opinion, that all human crises are fundamentally crises of thought. And it's important to keep this in mind. So when we consider the nature of crises, I'd like to share really the esoteric perspective, because I think it's very constructive or instructive in this way. And esotericism really is a fancy word to say that all life is the manifestation of energy of some sort. All forms are manifestations of energy of some sort. And so when we talk about esotericism, this is essentially what we mean. And from the esoteric perspective, one can define crisis as simply the bringing together of two conflicting energies into an enforced relationship. And this can happen consciously or unconsciously, but either way, it produces a point of friction. And this friction causes conflict. But it can, when the mind is used rightly and when the conscious will is present, this point of friction can instead be turned into a point of creative tension, a point of creative spiritual tension, because it has to do with the resolving of relationships and of moving towards the ideal. It's therefore spiritual, becomes spiritual. This, of course, requires the conscious direction of thought and the conscious direction of one's will. And it requires clear thinking and dispassion to use this tension rightly. And we may ask, considering the nature of crisis, why are crises and conflicts so prevalent in the life of humanity, in the human psyche, and in human consciousness? And it really is, I believe, because humanity is essentially a duality. On one hand, we exist in the world of form, and generally speaking, are identified and therefore attached to that form. On the other hand, we are in essence spiritual beings and are capable of higher thought. We are capable of inclusive love, and we are capable of working out the divine will through creative activity. And this duality of human nature is fundamentally the cause of all conflict in the individual human being and in humanity as a whole. And this sort of dual nature is underlying all the Ageless Wisdom traditions, which is the sort of spiritual and religious traditions of all ages have this dual nature of the human being is embedded in there. And also, as we consider crises in the life of humanity, there's one more point that I want to highlight, and that is that humanity has not chosen the slow and gradual way of natural evolution. The Ageless Wisdom teaches this. We have instead chosen the way of initiation. We've chosen to follow a process that brings about sudden and dramatic expansions of consciousness. And this necessarily has to occur through points of crisis. There's no other way. These points of crisis produce tension, and then eventually through electrical stimulation, there is an emergence into an existence which is closer to the ideal. And so just to conclude, before I take up way too much time, I'm already sort of at the limits, I realize, but I just want to highlight that the crisis that humanity is confronting today is rapidly reorienting a transformation and a reorientation of values towards its soul, what some call the better angels of our nature. This is being brought about through the agency of the soul, but this is not a purely metaphysical event. We have what Kathy and Steve both touched upon in the esoteric teachings, is the science of impression, which is evocation and invocation. There's a spiritual hierarchy in the planet. There are those greater beings, greater than us, that impress us with their divine consciousness. And as humanity reaches upwards towards the soul, towards this ideal, the hierarchy, or what we call the planetary soul, responds and impresses its energy upon humanity. This is deeply esoteric, but I want to highlight that it also happens in a way that's more mundane and more easily comprehensible by the majority of people who aren't familiar with these terms. And this happens simply, this sort of evoking the better angels of our nature happens because the leading thinkers of our world invoke, they mediate these new ideas, these new ways of thinking that highlight the values of the soul. They're mediating them into human thinking through their thought and through their expression of that thought. And this is really how the soul is being mediated into humanity, through right thinking. This creates crisis because there is this point of, because there's these idealists which bring in this sort of vision of the future, and that immediately conflicts with the status quo, which we know is still deeply bound to the past. And so there is a point of friction. And the task of all of us who are able to uphold this vision, to think and to vision and to think in terms of ideals, is to bring about this point of friction, to bring about a point of tension, because eventually this forces humanity to make a decision. Which aspect of our dual nature should we follow? Will it be the easy way of individualism over well-being, or will it be the more difficult way, the way of the whole, the way of self-effacement, the way of sharing, the way of self-forgetfulness, the way of evoking the better aspects of human creativity that we all know and appreciate. And there are some that may object and say, well, this is really kind of an oversimplification of humanity's dilemma. There are many, many, many very specific and very real political, economic, social, security, religious crises today that all require very specific solutions. But I believe very strongly that these underlying all of these problems has to do with this sort of dual nature of the human being, and of the necessity, and actually really the very real success of humanity evoking its soul. We have to remember that if either part of humanity's nature were to triumph, whether the higher or the lower, there really would be no more conflict. You know, physical situations will be what they were, but psychologically there would be no more tension or conflict. And really I should wrap up, but I just want to say in conclusion that we see that today the solutions really are there. There are many solutions out there. People have them. There's a very real need to implement them. That is growing. But what is missing is the will to implement them. And so we really, Kathy and Steve both brought up this idea of the spiritual will. And I think as we move forward, everything we can to evoke this higher will and to mediate that into expression, and to sort of know that paralleling this invocation of that will be the gradual resolution of humanity's problems in a more specific way. We must keep that in mind, because this sort of bringing in of this higher consciousness prepares the ground, and it lays the groundwork upon which these more specific problems can be found. And I think once that sort of higher will triumphs, we have the bringing in of what we call a different type of fire. You know, in the lower conflict, we have fire by friction, and in this higher triumph of the soul, we have the bringing in of what we call solar fire. And in the light of this solar fire, we have really it's the light within which one can look into the eyes of one's enemies and still see themselves. They can look into the eyes of their enemies and still see God, or still see divinity. And in this state, cooperation just becomes natural, becomes a natural occurrence. And when humanity makes this jump, we will see, I believe very strongly that nations of the world will be in a constant and natural state of cooperation. And that all these problems out there that already exist will naturally be solved. And so we will have 4 panelists later that will speak about some of their more specific work and how they see this working out in the world of everyday human living and being and existing. And so before I keep blabbering any further, I'd like to turn this back over to Kathy for a brief visualization that she will be leading. Kathy, are you there?
Thank you very much for leading us into the future, setting a course for us to follow. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Kathy.
So we have the PowerPoint. Okay, thank you. All right, so let's just take a moment to link in thought with all who are working together at this time with this visualization. Visualize the many individuals and groups around the world who are actively serving humanity with goodwill. See these individuals and groups as forming a vast lotus at the top of the planet. And from the heart of that lotus, project a bridge of lighted energy to the spiritual hierarchy of saints, rishis, bodhisattvas, and masters honored by all the world's religions and spiritual groups. Now project that line of lighted energy higher still towards the center of pure will, visualizing it as a radiant sun, a powerhouse of light. Now as we sound these words of power, let's imagine the flow of the tide of the new life as we sound the words. From the highest spiritual being upon our planet, through the graded spiritual groups of enlightened and perfected men who work upon the inner side of life, on into the outer world of daily living, where thinking, loving men and women serve. The tide of the new life sweeps. The plan is ready for immediate application and intelligent implementing. The workers are there, and the power to work is adequate to the need. Breathe in will energy and visualize it pouring down into the lotus of the new group of world servers. Reflect on the lotus as an expression of all the many qualities of the soul of the one humanity. See the energy circulating and blending all the many lights into one radiant light. Visualize this fiery lotus as radiating and scintillating light and goodwill out from the center. See the energy distributed through the 5 planetary inlets, the planetary star, London, Darjeeling, New York, Geneva, Tokyo, and see the energies permeating into the soul of all the countries of the world. And see it penetrating into the hearts and minds of all people everywhere, healing divisions, fostering right human relations, restoring peace on earth. Sound the mantra of unification. The souls of all are one, and I am one with them. I seek to love, not hate. I seek to serve and not exact due service. I seek to heal, not hurt. Let pain bring due reward of light and love. Let the soul control the outer form and life and all events, and bring to light the love that underlies the happenings of the time. Let vision come and insight. Let the future stand revealed. Let inner union demonstrate and outer cleavages be gone. Let love prevail. Let all people love.